I wanted to talk today about the background to the Dublin Monaghan bombings, the background in terms of Irish history, because I'm conscious that people who are watching this may not be familiar with Irish history. If you are familiar with Irish history, then you are welcome and probably best advised to skip this episode. But I'm conscious that a lot of people aren't. So there are a number of places we could start. Let's start, for the purposes of this programme, in 1920. 1920 was when Ireland was divided. It was divided in two by a law called the Government of Ireland Act 1920. This divided Ireland into North and South. To confuse matters, the northernmost part of Ireland is in the south, but we won't worry ourselves too much about that. It was divided into North and South. The North consisted of 6 counties of the traditional 32 counties, and the South consisted of the remaining 26 counties. The reason for the division was that the majority of the population in the North were Protestants and mostly identified as British and wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom when Ireland got independence. The South was majority Roman Catholic, and Roman Catholics mostly identified as Irish and were in favour of independence from being ruled by Great Britain. The circumstances were obviously enormously controversial. The Irish revolutionary leader James Connolly described the prospect of partition. He died before it came about, but he described the prospect of partition as something that would create a carnival of reaction, North and South, if it took place. In other words, you would have two deeply reactionary, backwards-looking states on one island, and it would be miserable for people who fell into the minority in the North or the minority in the South. I and a lot of other people would argue that James Connolly was correct in that diagnosis. Anyway, that was 1920 that Ireland was divided. In 1921, the south of Ireland got independence from Great Britain by way of a treaty that was signed and that came into effect the following year in 1922. The treaty was controversial amongst Irish nationalists, the people who fought for Irish independence, and they split, resulting in a civil war. The Civil War ended in 1923 when those who had opposed the treaty, giving the South independence, had to admit that they had lost and had been defeated. So the south of Ireland continued and became independent and remains independent to this day. The north of Ireland, Northern Ireland, as it is formally known, remained part of the United Kingdom ruled by London. As James Connolly predicted, they turned into very backwards-looking states, north and south. North of the border, members of the minority Roman Catholic community were systematically expelled in the 1920s from the Belfast dockyards. The dockyards in Belfast were one of the main sources of employment for workers in Northern Ireland. Belfast was the site of the Titanic setting off, notoriously. And so a great deal of Roman Catholics were expelled in sectarian, that is to say, discrimination based on a religion, were expelled from the dockyards and faced a lot of difficulty in getting employment. Not all Protestants agreed with this course of action. There were some Protestants who sympathized with their Catholic neighbours or co-workers, if you like, who were also expelled. I think around a quarter or a fifth of the dockyard expulsions were Protestants. There was also sectarian violence against Roman Catholics. Going into the end of the 1920s, 1930s, this tapered off. In 1939, the UK went to war with Germany. Southern Ireland remained neutral, although tens of thousands of Irish people south of the border, in their personal capacity, volunteered to fight against the Axis. South of the border, the situation of Protestants was not a particularly happy one either. Again, Protestants were in a minority in a majority Roman Catholic country. The south of Ireland did not allow, for example, for couples to get divorced if they were married. And in the 1937 Constitution, the inability to get divorce was actually codified in law. The confessional or religious-dominated nature of the state was reinforced when the Constitution of 1937 stated that the Roman Catholic Church had a particular special status in Ireland. The internal dynamics of the Roman Catholic religion also made life more difficult for Protestants. For example, there was a decree known as Netemer, which meant that when a Protestant and a Roman Catholic married each other, the child of the couple had to be raised as a Roman Catholic, regardless of what the couple actually wanted. And this led to a big decrease in the Protestant population south of the border. But there was no serious violence between the 1920s and the 1960s. There was violence against British forces both during the Second World War. There was a small amount of violence from the extreme wing of the Republican movement, but it never gained any traction. And when I say Republican, I mean people who were using force against Britain and British rule. The terminology can be quite confusing, so I'm going to try and use the term Irish nationalist just to keep things a bit simple. So then there was another Irish nationalist armed campaign known as the Border Campaign, targeting British rule in Northern Ireland, and again it didn't get very far. Then in the 1960s, people in Northern Ireland from a Roman Catholic background became much more educated due to the advent of free university education and so forth, and people started to learn about the civil rights struggle in the United States of America. They became much more organized, and they started to fight for their rights. In formal legal terms, Protestants and Roman Catholics in Northern Ireland had the same rights. But because of the Protestant domination, there were a lot of ways that this was circumvented in practice. There was a practice known as gerrymandering. This meant that the districts in which elections were held and determined would be drawn in a way that Roman Catholic voters were to a large extent disenfranchised. For example, if you had a constituency with 100 Roman Catholic voters and I don't know, I probably shouldn't go into figures, it's just because I'm just thinking off the cuff, but you had, if you had a constituency with a majority of Roman Catholic voters, let's say 100 Roman Catholic voters and 90 Protestant voters, they would be able to divide it into sub-districts so that the Roman Catholics were sort of segmented into districts where you had a big majority of Roman Catholics and then a number of other districts in which Protestants held a slight majority, meaning there was an overall majority of Protestants. I'm probably not explaining this very well, but you probably get the gist. The political system was used in a way that disadvantaged Roman Catholics. Now, Not all Roman Catholics were disadvantaged. There were plenty who were successful, but there was a serious issue in terms of discrimination and in terms of not having equal access to votes and participation in the political system in practical terms. The 1968 civil rights movement was focused on redressing this and having both formal and practical equality for everyone in Northern Ireland. The extreme wing, it should be said that the leadership of the, I suppose, Protestant parties were somewhat sympathetic to this, but there was an extreme led by a Protestant leader called Reverend Ian Paisley, who was very strongly opposed to any compromise with the Roman Catholic population and any granting of equal rights. This was partly for theological reasons, because Mr. Paisley, or Reverend Paisley, represented a particularly hardline Protestant sect known as the Free Presbyterian Church. In any event, there were serious clashes. The civil rights movement was depicted unfairly as being a sort of front for Irish nationalist extremists. This led to a lot of resistance from the Protestant, and in particular the working class Protestant community. People in Northern Ireland who want to remain with the United Kingdom are known as Unionists. So there was a lot of Unionist resistance. In the end, violence broke out, and there was a huge level of bloodshed. The police force in Northern Ireland was known as the Royal Ulster Constabulary. This was viewed by many people as a sectarian police force, and as the Troubles, which is what the violence became known as the Troubles continued, the Royal Ulster Constabulary became increasingly discredited in the eyes of the Roman Catholics. They used excessive force in putting down protesters, and eventually violence begat violence, and Irish nationalists became increasingly organised in the organisation known as the Irish Republican Army. The Irish Republican Army experienced a split in 1970, the circumstances of which are not really relevant to this series, and the dominant Irish nationalist force in terms of the violence and the use of force was the Provisional Irish Republican Army. That's the Provisional IRA. As to why it was called Provisional, that's a discussion really for another day. But it was this organisation, the Provisional IRA, that dominated what they would have described as the armed struggle for the next 28 years, until 1998, when the violence largely abated with a peace agreement. The hardline Protestants were represented by a number of organisations, paramilitary groups, and the most hardline and prominent of these was the Ulster Volunteer Force. Both the Provisional IRA and the Ulster Volunteer Force and most of the paramilitaries who became involved denied that they targeted civilians, but unfortunately a great deal of violence was targeted on civilians, and a great deal of the violence became sectarian. British troops, it's important to say, were deployed in Northern Ireland. First of all, when British troops were deployed in Northern Ireland, because they hadn't been there before, Northern Ireland had a lot of autonomy in the period between partition, the dividing of Ireland, and this period of violence known as the Trouble. Northern Ireland had a lot of autonomy. But when the violence broke out, the British government in London decided they had to step in, and the British Army was actually deployed directly to Northern Ireland in order to help quell the violence and unrest. First of all, the British Army were viewed as being preferable to the loyalists and the local government by the Roman Catholic population, but they became involved and perpetrated a number of atrocities, the most notorious of which took place in 1972. This was known as the Bloody Sunday atrocity, when British troops shot and killed 13 unarmed civilians who were protesting for their civil rights.
Father, how many dead have you seen in the bogside?
Appearing to be dead, there are the 3 in that Saracen car. There are 2 men lying at the end of this block of flats. There's another man at least very close to being dead. There are 2 others up there. I'm told that there are some more in these flats here that I haven't seen yet. I would say.
It led to a huge number of people who might not have sympathized with the use of force. It led to a huge number of those people joining and supporting the Provisional IRA, that is to say, the Irish nationalist militant organisation. Unfortunately for the Provisional IRA, a lot of people became disillusioned when they in turn became implicated in atrocities.
Bombs exploded every minute for 20 minutes in busy shopping areas and a crowded bus terminal. When the dust finally began to settle, the provisional wing of the IRA announced that it had been responsible. But it now looks as if the bombs of Bloody Friday destroyed more than the provisionals had intended. Anger at the indiscriminate carnage was felt all over Ireland, even among the provisionals themselves.
How did you manage to...
Number one, that I was no longer justified and I couldn't remain silent about the course of action which was pursued in the name of the Irish Republican Army, namely the bombing campaign which involved civilians, and that I could no longer remain silent about that the Republican Army and the people involved, very sincere people, and the aims of the Republican movement were being completely distorted and had gone completely off course, mainly to the actions of one man, Sean Stephen. But that man who in fact dismissed quite casually bomb victims who happened to be Protestants as with the remark that, oh well, it doesn't matter, they're bigots anyway, I found very disquieting, to say the least, when I realized, as I did and as I know, that that man is in fact in complete control of the controlling body of the Irish Republican Army, which is the Army Council. Then I felt I had to speak out.
So this cycle of violence unfortunately continued. In 1974, there was an attempt by the British government and the Irish government and moderate people in Northern Ireland, moderate people on the Irish nationalist side and moderate people on the Protestant and the mostly Protestant unionist side, tried to reach an agreement that would end the violence. It's important also to note the position of the Irish government, the government in the south of Ireland, known simply as Ireland under the Irish Constitution, in all of this. The Irish government was accused of standing by whilst this violence took place and came under a lot of pressure to intervene. There was even a plan, which never was brought into practice, to invade Northern Ireland in order to stop the violence against Roman Catholics. But the Irish government couldn't ignore the position, and they became more and more involved in trying to negotiate a solution with the British government. There was a huge amount of fear in the south that the violence in Northern Ireland would spill over south of the border, and you could have an all-island war, similar to what happened when Ireland was struggling for independence. So that's the background. To recap, Ireland was divided in 1920. This period of violence, known as the Troubles, began in 1968 and continued until 1998. With some violence afterwards. These things are never completely clear-cut. And there were atrocities on all sides, really. The violence initially began because Roman Catholics were fighting for their civil rights, which the Protestant leadership was reluctant to grant due to hardline unionist extremists. Provisional IRA was the organisation that became dominant on the Irish nationalist militant side, and the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF, became dominant on the Protestant Unionist side. That's not taking into account the fact that the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force, were also backing the union with Britain. Then you had moderate politicians, both nationalist and unionist, who, well, they might not have disagreed with all violence, but they disagreed or stated that they disagreed with paramilitary violence. So that brings us up to 1974, which is the year in which the Dublin Monaghan bombings took place. The agreement that both sides sought to reach was known as the Sunningdale Agreement. This was the agreement that would have seen Roman Catholics and Protestants sharing power in the government of Northern Ireland, and it would also have led to what was known as a Council of Ireland. This would have been a body for the island of Ireland, both north and south, that would have a consultative role. And people on the Irish nationalist side felt that the Council of Ireland could be a stepping stone towards a united Ireland, towards all of Ireland being a single jurisdiction. Hardline Republicans, hardline nationalists, and hardline unionists were both opposed to this attempt at a peaceful settlement. The hardline nationalists did not want to see Northern Ireland being recognised as a legitimate state or a legitimate entity at all. They wanted Britain to withdraw from Northern Ireland, full stop, and there to be a united Ireland. Hardline unionists did not want to have any kind of role for the south of Ireland in running the affairs of Northern Ireland, even if it was only a tokenistic role. And they did not want to have any kind of power sharing with the Roman Catholic population. Northern Ireland had been described as a Protestant state for a Protestant people. So this brings us up to the Sunningdale period, when there was an attempt to get this to get this on the road. The problem that they ran into was that there was a strike. It wasn't a normal strike whereby people cast a ballot and decide to take industrial action. It was a strike encouraged and enforced by hardline unionist elements. The strike was called the Ulster Workers' Council strike. There had not been any organisation known as the Ulster Workers' Council. It came out of nowhere in order to enforce this strike. And the purpose of this strike, which was backed by organisations like the Ulster Volunteer Force, was to bring down the power-sharing government in Northern Ireland that sought to share power between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics. So that brings us up to the immediate background to the Dublin and Monaghan bombings.